Our first speaker tonight is Dan Proft. Dan Proft is a former Republican candidate for governor and a current talk show host on WLS Radio in Chicago. I believe Saturdays, you said. Is that correct, Dan? Saturday? And Sundays. Proft serves as the chapter president of Operation Homefront Illinois, a nonprofit that provides emergency assistance to active duty Illinois military families and wounded warriors who have returned home from service. Proft is a small businessman who runs a media consulting company called Starfish that he founded. Proft grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, and currently resides in Chicago. Please welcome Dan Proft.
Thank you, and it's great to be with you all tonight. I appreciate it. Robert Brokish, member of Mensa, had he won that state rep race, he would have tripled the median IQ in Springfield overnight. So, no offense to senators and the legislature, of course, present company excluded, of course. But no, it's great. I mean, it's great to be here tonight at the epicenter of Wisconsin politics. And honestly, watching from Chicago, I was a little bit jealous of all the action that was going on here at the Clock Tower and in Rockford. David Hale rounding up a posse and following these guys around, and all the work that Republicans did here. I mean, it was a trip. It was great to watch. I really applaud what you guys did in making the Democrats here ultimately flee back north of the cheese curtain. So that's good. And it's amazing to me to watch the Wisconsin Republicans too. I mean, that they're trying to get their Democrats back, and we can't get ours to leave. So as it turns out, and then of course they set a bad example, just as Chicago Democrats in charge of Illinois set a bad example, and then Indiana Democrats come over to Urbana. Obviously, we have become a sanctuary state for liberal Democrats. And I noted, just again, yesterday, as predicted by anybody who has a rudimentary understanding of economics, we're seeing businesses leave Illinois, and that's not funny. Catalyst, a trade show company out of Crystal Lake, announced that they were leaving for Pleasant Prairie, and that made the news yesterday, as some of you probably saw. So we're in a position in Illinois where we're trading our businesses and jobs for more liberal Democrats. It's a trade only the Cubs would make. But I do come with some good news from Chicago. And the good news is that Chicago's population is at its lowest level since 1920. So it's a little bit of schadenfreude, but it's good news nonetheless. Although the ones that left are not named Madigan or White or Cullerton or Madigan or Daley or Emanuel. But the other good news is that we have governors across the country providing an example of how you solve this arithmetic problem that every state is facing, including Illinois. Obviously, a lot of mention has been given to Scott Walker, and deservedly so. But let's not forget, Scott Walker is kind of version 2.0. It was Mitch Daniels in Indiana 6 years ago as one of his first acts as governor who decertified the public sector unions and got this ball rolling. Turns out, too, Indiana did not fall into economic disrepair and cease to exist. In fact, Indiana became one of the national leaders in economic growth during Mitch Daniels' tenure, the last 6 years as governor. They brought more foreign investment into that state in the last 3 years than any other state in the nation, and he's done exactly what he said he would do, which is make sure that Indiana's per capita income was on this trajectory instead of this one when he took office. That's exactly what he's done. One of his first acts was taking on the public sector unions. And we're seated in Wisconsin, and New Jersey, and Michigan, and Ohio, and Florida. All these newly elected Republican governors, and in many cases, Republican state legislatures, who are drawing the battle lines where they need to be drawn. Not because they're punitive, not because anybody doesn't like teachers or firefighters or cops. Of course, it's silliness. but because they have an arithmetic problem to solve, one they inherited from decades of mismanagement by Democrats in their state. I mean, Governor Walker, we had the opportunity to interview a couple of the Democrat state senators who were at undisclosed locations in Illinois over the last several weeks on WLS, and it was amazing to listen to them talk about Scott Walker. Scott Walker's done this, and Scott Walker's done that, and this is what's going to happen because Scott Walker's been in office for 2 months. Jim Doyle and Wisconsin Democrats were the ones that brought you to wherever you don't want to be at this point in terms of the budget deficits and the economic, the lack of economic vitality that you're experiencing. So I guess the question becomes, at least the question that I think we need to answer is, how do we get in on this action? Obviously, we don't have a Republican governor, or we don't have Republican-controlled General Assembly. But I don't think that means that we can't get in on this national debate. In fact, I think it's incumbent upon us to do so. And I think one of the things that it's important to recognize, just kind of as a baseline, in terms of how you approach this fight, if you will, is to recognize that politics is a fight. There's no reason to be here if you're not willing to stand up and fight for something. I don't mean that in a violent sense, of course. I'm talking about competing views on how society should be ordered, what values should be extolled. I mean, we're not here, as good as the jelly beans and the cake is, we're not here for that. We're here because you believe in core principles that transcend the individual, that we are supposed to see reflected in our laws, in our lawmakers, and the kind of society in which we live. It is a fight. So, you know, I understand it's easy to get cowered by media that misrepresents our positions, to get kind of bought into the groupthink of bipartisanship. But I think it's important to recognize that politics is about drawing lines and about fighting for those things in which you believe. Otherwise, as I said, there's no reason to be here. We need to decide if, yeah, we're our brother's keeper, but we're not our brother's sugar daddy. And to me, that is a useful line to draw. Because what's happened, the great opportunity the public sector unions, particularly in Wisconsin, but elsewhere, have provided, is they've exposed themselves for who they are. Right? Here's who they want to be. They want to be people who live a life without risk. And guess what? Nobody gets to do that. Nobody gets to live a life without risk. And here's something else. And I know we're zeroed in on SEIU and AFSCME, but here's something else for every public sector union member. And I've worked in the public sector too. I've worked in state government, local government. I have no animus towards anybody in the public sector. You have to give that qualifier. like we hate anybody because you're a teacher or a firefighter. It's just so ridiculous. Of course that's not the case. But you don't get a blank check. Nobody gets a blank check in life either. You don't get a blank check, and you don't get to live a life without risk. Now it's time for that adult conversation. Now that we've gotten those two obvious statements that seem to evade the comprehension of our politicians out of the way. And so, exposing who they are. Teachers in Wisconsin holding up signs at these rallies. First they came for the teachers. For those of you who don't know, that is a reference to Martin Niemöller, who was a Lutheran pastor during the Third Reich, who made a famous statement about standing up against Nazi annihilation, basically. First they came for the trade unionists, but I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. Then they came for the Lutherans, but I wasn't a Lutheran, and I didn't stand up. And then they came for me, and then there was nobody left to stand up for me. That's Niemöller. They're invoking standing against Nazi annihilation as commensurate with asking them to contribute 5% of their salaries to their guaranteed pension. I mean, this is beyond unhinged. And it needs to be called out for such. It needs to be called out for the hysterics that it is. That is something, again, the layers of hypocrisy on display. Civil discourse, right? In the wake of the tragic shooting of Representative Giffords in Arizona, we were supposed to be more civil in our discourse. Well, that lasts about as long as until they don't get what they want, and then civility is out the window. Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, said today, and Obama has his teleprompter. I have my BlackBerry because I want to get his quote exactly right. It's Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO. April 4th is the day on which Martin Luther King Jr. gave his life for the cause of public collective bargaining. Is that right? Yeah, oh, that's right. Of course, the speech now was, it's not the color of your skin that matters, it's the content of your collective bargaining agreement. That's right. I remember that vividly now. Again, they will use whatever it takes. They will say whatever is required to advance their interests. And they will use demagoguery that is racially tinged, that is classist, whatever it takes to advance their position. Because they're bullies. And how you deal with bullies, as we all learned in 5th grade, is at some point on the playground, if reason fails, somebody's got to stand up and punch somebody in the nose. And that's what, frankly, you have governors doing rhetorically and through policy in state capitals, not named Springfield, around this country. The other thing, again, consistent with this idea of not living a life without risk, collective bargaining rights, they're privileges, right? The collective bargaining privileges that public sector unions currently enjoy, unfettered as they are in a few states, like Wisconsin up until recently, like Illinois currently, were not brought down on tablets from Mount Sinai. They were enacted by statute, and they can be rescinded in the same way. And there's a difference between public sector unions and the private sector trade unions, and we should make this point clear as well, which is that private sector unions, at least in that situation, you have true adversarial management labor negotiations, where folks, there's consideration on both sides, you enter into a contract just as any other private sector transaction. In the public sector, of course, they're on both sides of the deal, right? They finance the people that they elect, and then they turn around and they're going to go negotiate the contracts with those same people. And then you wonder why you get the contracts that you do with politicians on a very short-term time horizon saying, sure, I'll make promises that I know we'll never be able to finance, because by the time the rubber meets the road, I'll be long gone, and it'll be somebody else's problem to deal with. And so you have Illinois, which is the uber example of that type of financial irresponsibility, the largest unfunded pension liability in the country, and growing with each passing day.